Hey, I heard about ActiveRecord Tenanted today and I had a lot of questions about it. So I figured why not just go through the source code and answer some of those questions with you. All right. First thing is first, what is ActiveRecord Tenanted? Let's talk about how Rails works today. If you spin up a Rails application today and say you're building a SaaS application, generally you're going to put a lot of customers in one database. And you're going to have a table called like account ID or accounts. And then each table in your application is going to have like an account ID to it. There's some gems that already kind of deal with that. And it works. Like that is a proven method. It works. But there are some trade-offs to that that is just not discussed very much. Mainly, it is a security issue. If you have all of your customers' data, actually multiple customers in one database, there's a potential that some code could leak data. You're also always dealing with scopes by account ID and all those things. For the most part, though, it does work. However, if you have one huge database, and say that database is in the United States, your customers from Europe or your customers from Australia, they have to go all the way to that centralized database. So there are some trade-offs that we have whenever we have these centralized databases. So ActiveRecord Tenanted, the idea there is that each customer gets their own database. This was announced at Rails World, and I believe this uses SQLite for the initial thing. So let's actually look at the source code and start to answer some of these questions. All right, if we just look at the README, it goes over what is multi-tenancy. Already reviewed that. And then this goes over how you can add ActiveRecord Tenanted, usage, all that fun stuff. I haven't looked at the guide yet, so let's crack that open. Also, one thing to keep in mind, I'm probably going to have some critique about this gem. This is very early stages, pre 1.0, so take these critiques with a grain of salt. I'm sure whoever's working on this is thinking about this or has thought about it. But this is mostly for you to think about whenever you're considering having multiple databases, or I should say one database per customer. All right. So the first thing is first, I believe initial support for this only works with SQLite. And we may see that in the source code. We're gonna check that out. So here's links to prior art, which is awesome. I have critiqued that before. Always have prior art in your applications so that other people can look at it and just understand and assess kind of what problems are you solving, what problems are your project solving that haven't been solved by other gems. This is awesome to see this. I'm already like quite pleased with how this stuff works. All right, so there's some configuration here. Again, they're using YAML files. I actually kind of wish that Rails could move away from using YAML files for databases. It's just getting so complicated. There should ideally be a database.rb file just to deal with like all these different databases that may being routed to or secondaries. That's kind of a tangent, so I'm going to skip that. It looks like we have some configuration here that this gives us, and let's see. Migrations are the thing that I'm actually interested in here, and I have a lot of questions about. How do migrations work? So I'm looking forward to diving into that source code. It looks like they have thought about migrations. We'll see what that looks like. Cool. We got a bunch of to-dos here, so we can see database path for. Interesting. So I guess if everything's going through a database path for and a tenant name, that's actually not much different than how it's done today, where all your data is housed in one database. So you're still, if you have this kind of multiple databases, you're still going to be dealing with a request hits this application and that gets routed to this specific database. So I guess that's something to keep in mind. You're still going to be running one instance of a Rails application, and that one instance is going to be talking to multiple databases. It will not be multiple instances of a Rails app talking to its own instance of a database. It's an important thing to keep in mind. So just keep that in mind. All right, so it looks like there's some work being done here with connection pools. I actually don't know a ton about connection pools. I know that the only thing I know about them is very basic knowledge. If you have 10 connections, say to Postgres or something like that, that has to be in a pool. And if you have like 100 queries that need to be run, the first 10 will go to the database and then the rest have to wait in line for those, I guess, connections to free up so that it can execute it. So it'll be interesting to see kind of what happens to pooling here. I would follow somebody else for that, not me. We have database tasks. That's cool. We have tenants. So, all right, you can, it looks like that's done. You can migrate one specific tenant, and there's a lot of other database tasks that need to be done here. So whoever is working on this, I really hope that these tasks can be moved out of Rake and into a Ruby class that runs all these things, because I think it's going to become important to have tooling around this, and Rake is going to be one of those interfaces into that tooling. So what I'm hoping happens is most of this stuff ends up being pulled out of Rake, put into a class, and then of course you want to keep the Rake tasks around. So those Rake tasks would then be calling those methods on the class. All I can do at this point is kind of share that and hope that that happens. I have looked around inside a Rails source for this, and there are some parts of the application, or I should say there's some parts of ActiveRecord that have been extracted into a class and reintegrated with Rake, and some have not. So it's kind of a mixed bag. It's probably done on an as-needed basis, but like hopefully whoever is doing this really hard and important work kind of does some cleanup there so that we can have more of an ecosystem of tooling around this and management tools, which I think will become important for managing these multiple tenants. Cool. All right. So we have race conditions being thought about, pruning connections with connection pool. I can tell there's been a ton of thought that has gone into this, which is pretty awesome. And like overall, I'm very pleased with what I'm reading here. It very quickly kind of gives me an idea of where is this project at. It's still obviously very early, but I'm feeling pretty confident about this. Even if this was not something that Basecamp was working on, I would be looking at this thinking like, okay, this is going to be good. It's a matter of kind of seeing this to the end, getting through all these to-dos, having the discussions that need to be had, and get these things out. Uh, Very interesting stuff though, like how much of this is being considered. This is kind of insane, actually. I was not expecting to see consideration for Action Mailer or Action Mailbox. Cool. I'm very pleased with this guide. I actually think it's more valuable than the README, but I get it. The README is very like quick TLDR. You don't want to overwhelm people when you README. So I think like if I had to critique the README, I would say there's a ton in the guide for like kind of roadmap type stuff. If you need to compare this with other solutions out there, go check it out. All right. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on these things other than just know these links exist. I'll scan them and kind of see what's going on here. This will probably go into some of the problems that people have dealing with multiple tenants. I know I've asked this question a few times in different forums, and pretty much everybody agrees like migrations are a sticking point, so we'll get into that. All right, so I think this is how, all right, here's how Collide is doing multi-tenancy. It looks like they have a module that they're probably including in, let's see, account ownable. This looks like an ActiveRecord situation. All right, so they're integrating into current. That's cool. They did it in 30 lines, so that's probably worth checking out. All right, let's see how ActiveRecord multi-tenant is dealing with this. Multi-tenant databases. All right, cool. So this one works today with Postgres and other databases. All right, multi-tenant customer belongs to site. Looks like you include this in ActiveRecord, and then you say, who's the tenant? Is it a customer? And write only mode, frequently asked questions. Cool. Nice. They have some prior to access tenant. All right, apartment. I've heard of this one a lot. If I had to say like this is the big one, the most mature one, I would say this is it. I actually, mostly because I've heard of it. I've never heard of ActiveRecord tenant here, but it could very well be more stars. Okay, whatever that means. All right, but this is the one that I've heard the most about, apartment, and it's kind of the same story, right? You have a tenant and you say like, hey, this is for this customer and this is going to be pointed to this database. I actually don't know if this is pointed to a different databases per customer. Middleware considerations, dropping tenants. Let's see what the README says. All right, multiple tenants, your Rails application, certain data. All right, so it looks like this one is creating a database per tenant, and there's different ways of dealing with databases like Postgres versus SQLite. So you can switch tenants. There's tenants per request. There's middleware. Good stuff. All right, and then of course, I guess acts as tenant. That one has the most stars. Cool. Looks like Chris Oliver's been in here. It's usually a good sign. 5 months ago. You can sponsor. Yeah, Interesting. Erwin M's repo. You can sponsor Chris Oliver. Cool. Go Chris. All right. Row level multi-tenancy for Rails apps. Okay, so I think this one is an example of uh, a multi-tenant approach that has an account ID per row in a database. So that's what I talked about earlier. We have like an accounts table, and then say accounts have blog posts, and posts would have an account ID in it. All right, so I think that's it for the readmes. That gave us a pretty good sense of uh, what we're dealing with here for ActiveRecord Tenanted. Let's look at the source code now. Not much there. Tenanted. That's a fun one to say. Let's start opening some files here. All right, so we got some tenants here, connection classes. We're putting a new connection class in there. Interesting. All right, we'll go back here. I'm going to close these so that we can get some more tabs open here. All right, actually what I'm interested in is the rake tasks. So I do want to open that. So the question at the end of the day we're going to have to deal with is like, how do you run the migrations on this? And here's what I'm curious about. So I think there's a few strategies for running these migrations. And I think the first one, and the way that I think most people are handling this, is you deploy a new Rails application and then you run a migration. But it actually, since there's multiple databases, it has to loop through each database and run that migration. So there's some questions there, like, can you do migrations concurrently? What happens if a migration fails? You almost end up with kind of a worker queue in that scenario where you have these jobs that fail in the migrations and some that don't. So I don't know if there's going to be some kind of background job worker, because think about it. If you're using solid queue or something like that to manage your background jobs um, in Rails, like how's that going to work if you have to migrate that database? I'm guessing there's going to be some kind of like database for kind of the application that has all the account IDs in it, and then each tenant below that would have its own schema. But there's really a lot of interesting questions there, and based on what I see in this rake task thing, you're going to have a migrate tenant. So this loads the configuration. We migrate a single tenant. This one migrates all the tenants. So we have a migrate all and database tasks. All right, so this is good. This is what I was talking about, where we have these classes where you can call the method on it and all right, extend self. So the root config tenants. So one thing I'm not a huge fan of here is it's a singleton, which means you can't pass the configuration. There's just hard coded to a root config. Maybe you can set the root config, but um, generally when you're designing applications, singletons, I think, are a sign of smell. You should be able to pass a configuration into there to initialize it and then do your thing. So anyway, it's not a huge deal. We have a root config and we check to see, hey, what tenants are there? And then we go through each tenant. Good, we have a new tenant configuration here on root config, and then we run the migrate method on it. So let's see what new tenant is. All right, we have the tenant name and it sets up the database for it, configures the database connection, and then of course it probably runs the migrate method on it. So let's see what that looks like. Tenants each. So we're going to migrate config. All right, nice. And this is doing what we'd expect. It's calling the migration method. It's loading the schema. And here we go, migration context, migrate, schema clear. All right, so that's cool that we are, I don't know if this has always existed, but we're gonna have programmatic access to the migrations. All right, let's jump back out of this. And where were we? In the tasks. So we're deep in the tasks, in the rake tasks here. All right, so there's a way to migrate all the tenants. You can reset a tenant, drop a tenant. All right, so this is kind of lines up with what we'd expect from ActiveRecord, just running these databases. And we can see that it's actually doing that. It's saying, hey, when you run db migrate, we're actually going to migrate all the tenants. I'm curious though, is there like a single like application? So what I mean by a single database for your application, if you set up a SaaS, let's call it like, I don't know, it's a chat like Slack, for example. Slack runs their own application that has all their customers in it. And they have to also have a database that points each customer to whatever tenant that they're using. So there's got to be some table somewhere that is tracking, here's the tenants, here's the database that this user that registered with us is using. And then, of course, Rails would pick that up. I'm probably missing that, or it doesn't exist, but more likely I'm missing it because I'm kind of shooting from the hip here. But you know what? Let's keep rolling with this. All right, so opening this code here. We already looked at database tasks. Here's a job. Let's see what's going on in there. Interesting. All right, so okay, all right. This looks like an active job module that is going to be able to, if you enqueue a job for a tenant, it looks like it's going to run that on their database, which makes sense. So you're going to have, I'm guessing, a single pool of active record workers running for all tenants. But whenever you fire off that job, it needs to find, hey, what tenant am I running this job for? So that connect to that tenant's database. So that's pretty cool. Mailer, I remember I was kind of surprised to see that. So, all right, I guess if you're URL options, interesting. Okay, so I think we're gonna get some URL options for this, which looks like, I don't know, options host and the tenant. Oh, so this is just passing tenant through the URL options, which that makes me wonder now if we're gonna have in our helper methods, if we have to pass the tenant. So let's type in URL and see what we got here. All right, no matches found, no worries. All right, let's see what we have in relation. So what I'm starting to kind of gather now is that this is touching all parts of Rails. If you have a relation, it's going to be injecting the tenant into the relation. So again, if you're Slack and say a channel has many messages, you're going to want to know, like, okay, which tenant do all these messages live on? And I'm guessing storage is the same thing. You're going to have active storage per tenant because you don't want to store all the files in the same object store. You're going to want to have a different tenant per object store. Tenant selector, let's go ahead and check that out. This is probably the thing that is going to figure out a connection is made to a Rails application, and this thing has to figure out, like, okay, well, which tenant are we going to be using to service this request? And this looks like a piece of rack middleware. Yeah, all right. So we have a tenant resolver. Should get into that. Cool. All right. So what this does is it's a piece of middleware. It's going to live in the Rails application somewhere. There's a connection made to it, and then it's going to figure out, okay, which tenant are we working with, and set that up. All right. Let's look at a tenant. I think this is going to be kind of no, it's a module. All right. We'll see. We'll see what's going on here. I was assuming that this would be a class, but it is not. But I'm guessing this one would tell us roughly, like, here's all of the stuff that's going to go on with tenant. Nope, not really. I'm not really sure what to make of this. Current tenant, destroy tenant, tenants, connection pool. And this is clearly a module that's designed to be included in something because of this concern thing. So, all right, all right. Again, I'm shooting from the hip here. I'm trying to figure this out. I think tenant common is probably the thing. No, I'm not even going to speculate on this. I don't know what this is. We'll leave it at that. Subtenant. Okay, that's interesting. A tenant is a subtenant of. This feels ambitious to me. Like, now I'm picturing you have your kind of root application, which has its tenants, and then that tenant can have subtenants. It's interesting. I'm not sure, like, what the limits are on this, but all right. Let's jump into the rail tie. That can tell us, that can give us some clues sometimes before initialize. Because this is just setting things up. All right, I guess this is making all the patches, right? So that middleware I was talking about, we see that here, the tenant selector. That's just saying, all right, load this as a middleware, and then we have our active record relation. We're injecting the tenanted relation in there. And this thing is pretty much just, I don't want to say patching Rails because this is how Rails modules work, but it is injecting the behavior of tenancy into Rails through the rail tie. So we can kind of see what happens when this is initialized, and it's touching a lot. This is ambitious. It's pretty much touching all of Rails, which is surprising. I would have expected this to only touch the database. Cool. I see some comments here saying like, hey, there's a lot to think about. I'm guessing, since this is all to-dos, these will be internals of Rails that are probably refactored just to have better interfaces so that this thing can plug in through a rail tie and not have to be these patches. Again, I'm shooting from the hip here, making these guesses, but just reading through the source, that's my take on what's going on here. Let's see what global ID is. Locator. All right, so this is tying into the global ID class, which is actually, like, I think a pretty cool class. Let's have a quick look at that, and it's likely injecting the tenant into the global ID. So you can see here, you can get a global ID. It gives you the string like this, and see we have app person /1. It's probably injecting a path into this thing, the tenant path. Yeah, so we have a GID tenant. And you would want that, right? If you're getting a global ID, it's which app are we talking? Then you suddenly have to worry about which app it is. So cable connection also has tenancy. Man, this is just touching everything. All right, so this answers my question about what the migration strategies are. So I've actually thought through this in other contexts, and here's what a deployment would look like. Let's say you get all this stuff into an application. It's version 1.0. They've thought through kind of most of the situations here. The question then is, whenever you make a deployment and there's a database change, how do you run those schemas? Can you like deploy the Rails application, and do you have to migrate through each one of these things? And it looks like yes. Whenever you do a deployment and you run rakedb migrate, you're looping through all the databases, and the application is technically not deployed. I mean, I guess it depends on your deployment strategy, but you would run this one task, it would migrate your databases. So one consequence of that is when you deploy a Rails application with multiple tenants, you're going to have to think a lot more about, is the new deployment backwards compatible with these database changes? And there's a whole bunch of stuff on the internet on how to do that, but you're going to want to think about that. Because you can think, if you deploy and say you have 10,000 tenants, it takes time to migrate each one of those databases. So you're going to put your deployment out there. You're probably going to run the migration. That deployment needs to be compatible with both the new and the old version of the database. And then maybe once all those migrations finish up, then you'll deploy the updated version that is only compatible with the new databases after you've migrated those things. Something I don't see on here. Actually, first of all, I will say that this looks like it is, yes, it is a SQLite specific implementation. Not surprising at all. This is insanely ambitious. I can see why they're focusing on SQLite. I'm guessing they're using this for SQLite, and actually SQLite is great for this, to have multiple tenants. That's actually why I'm most excited about this, because I do think if each customer in a SaaS application can have its own SQLite database, it's going to be really fast. You're going to have to worry a heck of a lot less about performance issues. Even N+1 queries in a SQLite database, you're better off having N+1 problems in your queries. So it's interesting. I'm glad they're focused on the SQLite use case here, and I think that's actually where this is going to be the most useful and the most interesting. What I was hoping to see is an ability to run migrations, like I said before, where you just loop through all of the migrations and everything's fine. But I think it would be cool to have, and actually, you'll see this in a few applications. If you've ever launched a desktop application, say like an email client or even Photos app, sometimes this thing crops up after you upgrade it, and it says, hey, I need to do some housekeeping here. And what that is generally doing in the background is it's upgrading the database. So your email client probably has a database in it. If you actually use Photos app on Mac, it's actually using a SQLite database, and it has to run migrations on that schema. So when you launch the application, you get this little loader, and it says, hey, I have to run this migration first before you can continue. Now, what I think would be cool is if Rails can figure out some way of showing that. So you can imagine a middleware that you drop into this thing, you run the application, this message comes up and it says, hey, uh, your application database needs to be migrated. So maybe it runs that migration and it would, again, since it's SQLite, it's gonna be very fast. It's not like this multi-tenant database situation that takes like, hours to run and locks your database. It would be this very fast local migration of a SQLite database. If it lasted longer than a minute, I would be very surprised, especially if you're running on a modern host with NVMe storage. Uh, so it'd be pretty cool to see that built into this, some kind of middleware that can kind of tell the people accessing their tenant, hey, just stand by, we're going to upgrade your database. Um, if that is a thing or was a thing, then this compatibility issue that I talked about would be less of a concern, right? Because if you do a deployment, you don't have to worry about backwards compatibility. Let's hit reset. Here's what I would want to see for a deployment. You deploy your Rails application to whatever tenant you're using. The next step, once that code is live, you would want to run those rake tasks. You ideally are going to loop through all the databases and update those things. Um, Run those migrations so they're running the latest schema. However, say you have 10,000 databases, that could take, I don't know, a few hours, let's say. During that time, you don't want your customers to use an older version of the database. So ideally, if a customer hits your application while you're running that task, it could just migrate the database right then and there for that one customer who's trying to use their application. So you'd have that going on for people who are trying to use their application. And then obviously on the side, you would still be running that loop that's going through all your databases. So you would actually be kind of running two migration strategies at the same time. I know that sounds crazy, but it's less crazy than it sounds. Um, and hopefully we see something like that. I could see that improving the way that deployments work on this thing and bring some sanity to the database migrations. So anyway, it's pretty cool to see that. Um, I didn't realize there were already a lot of other projects that do that. And I think what the tenancy thing is one thing, but the fact that it's using SQLite, I think is awesome, and it will unlock how people, or will change the way how people think about deploying Rails applications. Um, Specifically, you can now run them closer to your users. So if you deploy to, um, let's say you have servers in the EU and you have servers in the US and you have servers, say, in Japan, you could run 3 instances of a Rails application there. Each one would have their own tenants. You can imagine running this on some huge hardware boxes, 1 box each. And it's gonna make web applications a lot faster and I think more robust. If the centralized database goes down, it's going to be less of an issue because you can just route to these different tenants. So pretty exciting stuff. Can't wait to see where this goes. Glad they put prior art into the README and should be good times. See ya.